So, let's get into it. There was a bit of confusion before we walked in today, and lucky Matt and I know each other because he thought he was facilitating and I thought I was facilitating. But we tossed a coin, and apparently I lost and I'm facilitating.
I didn't see a coin toss, but anyway.
So, what the situation? Matt is he was a reporter, a journalist for over 20 years with The Australian. He worked here and overseas and had a great reputation. But he had an itch he wanted to scratch, and that was he wanted to write a crime book. And things fell into place, and he jumped in and had a go. And he's written his first book, Black River, which is also, you won an award, I believe, this weekend?
I won an award from Andy Muir just yesterday, I think it was. So well, you're the only one on the board here, Andy.
So I'm sitting here with an award winner. Now, welcome.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks for coming, everyone.
Why? What drove you? What inspired you to write a book? What was that itch that you had that you felt the need to?
Well, it was a hatred of journalism, I think. I'd done 20 years on the paper, and a lot of that was nights. So broadsheet newspapers, 10 years ago, were probably more important than they are today because the internet hadn't completely overtaken everything. But the point working on them is that I was often clocking on at 5 o'clock in the evening and going till 1 or 2 at night when the paper went to bed. And, with 3 children, and 20 years of that sort of took its toll. And I'd never loved journalism, so I wanted to get out of it, to get out of that industry. And my background was a sort of literature degree from the Sydney University. So I think literature or writing was always a bigger love for me than journalism. And so then when I did leave, I thought, well, why don't I give it a shot? It was a process because I didn't realise, I thought fiction would be impossible because I thought I had to know everything before I started, the whole story. But in fact, what I came to realise was all you needed was an idea. So then when I figured that out, that's when I started writing the book, which took a long time.
Why this genre? Why crime? What steered you in that direction? Why not a love story?
I could have done a love story, I suppose. I think what I wanted to do was write an entertainment. So it really is a book for readers, and a lot of work went into it to make it hopefully presentable to readers and almost easy to read. And I just thought that a sort of plot-driven crime story would be the best way for me to do that. I think I was coming out of books like Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs. They were crime books that I'd really loved. So I think that's what sort of steered me into the genre.
Okay, so with the book Black River, and I was a homicide detective for a long time, so I can vouch for the credibility of the content of the book. It's fiction, but there was a lot of realism there. How did you select the storyline? You said the book started with an idea. What was the idea?
So the idea, and obviously people won't have read the book, but the idea was that something had gone wrong in a big old boys' boarding school out at North Parramatta. A journalist who'd been raised at this school, his father had worked there, was sent back out to the school to cover what had gone wrong. And at this point I didn't know what it was that had gone wrong, just that it involved a police investigation. A journalist who knew the place but hadn't been there for 30 years was sent back to cover it for the newspaper. And the idea was as simple as that, and with no more skin on the bone, what had gone wrong or anything. That just developed as I started to write it.
Okay, I often wonder with fictional books like that, do you know the ending? Have you got it all mapped out? Do you know the ending before you put pen on paper?
So at 30,000 words of the first draft of the book, so we're talking about, a good third of the book, in that first draft, I didn't know who'd done it. I had no idea. And it was, I mean, a lot of crime writers will say the same. It's really just fly by the seat of your pants and follow and see where it takes you. And you're creating characters and scenes. And so I'd be sitting in a scene with a police detective. What would they do? Where would it end up? And you're populating the areas with people. And then, the murderer just popped out of that.
Do you well, where do I take it from there? How do you get yourself into that mindset? Because I often think with people writing these books, and there's some creepy, horrible stuff in the book and other books. Where's that come from?
From reading, I suppose, from reading other books, but also I think that is actually the creative process, which I didn't realise, when I was doing it. And so people would read the book or parts of the book for me, and one of the early pieces of feedback I was getting from people was it probably needs to be a bit nastier. So the book took 3 years and went through several iterations of, so maybe 12 drafts by the end of it, with various editors. And it's always, hopefully, in that process, just getting a little bit better. But major plot points are just being dumped on the floor. And I suppose with that sort of creepy, nasty stuff, I just built up to that as I went. And I thought, well, I can stop sort of looking at it like this, and it's starting to work, on its own as a nasty little thing. So I'll keep that going.
It develops from there. In the book, there's a crossover between the world of the media and the world of policing, like high-profile jobs, and it's a world that I understand. There was so much, and now, since I've finished my time in the police, I'm working in the media, and there were so many examples in the book that, from a journalistic point of view, it was so real, like the editor's walking around with his shoe off because he's suffering gout in his big toe. Little nuances like that came across. Is that something that you tried to put on the page from your experience within the media?
Yeah, so a little detail like that of an editor with his shoe off having gout, that was an editor I knew when I was young at the Australian. There's a bloke called Malcolm Schnitke, hopefully he's not here today. And he wasn't even a drinker or anything, but he had gout and he used to walk around the newsroom with his shoe off because his gout was playing up. So I think little details like that are sort of gold.
Okay. Now, we've got a friendship through a mutual friend, Rob Carlton, introduced us, and we spent a lot of time catching up. And do you want to talk us through that from your perspective? Then I'll give you my perspective.
So yeah, I had this mutual. So Gary and I didn't know each other, but we have a dear mutual friend who we're both very fond of, and I'd known him for a long time from university days. And when I told Rob that I was trying to write this book, and that I was trying to tell the story not so much from the perspective of the journalist, but also from the police officer, that I really needed to do some research and talk to police officers. And Rob said, well, I know one, so he set up for me to talk to Gary. Gary was still a police officer when this process started. He was the Detective Chief Inspector of New South Wales Homicide. So he said, yeah, okay, come over. Like he didn't know me from Burrough, but come over and we'll sit down and I'll give you half an hour, 40 minutes. So anyway, I did that, and I had a lot of questions. And Gary, to his credit, gave me the time and answered them. And then sort of 6 months later, I'd need to go back and check things or ask some more. So Gary, yep, okay, come again. We'll sit down, in a cafe near his house. And I remember in this meeting, we'd probably been going an hour. Gary is a serving police officer with a job to do, and I'm sort of thinking, about 2/3 of the way here asking these questions, and Gary just stands up, says, see ya, I got to go to Wollongong, and just walks out. And I'm like, but I've got 5 more questions here.
Well, I'm not sure if it was Wollongong, but I knew I had to go. It was always a good excuse when you're a homicide detective. If you want to get away, you just say, "I'm sorry, there's a murder. I'm out of here." But I think it was something along those lines. But Matt, and you can see the personality of Matt. Like, he was very humble in his approach to me. He's going, "Look, so sorry for your time. So sorry for taking up your time." And as he said, Rob Carlton's a good mate of both of ours, so I didn't have a problem. But what I don't think Matt understood, the world of policing, from me, I'm just talking from a personal point of view, it was a very dark world. You don't bring much joy into the world when you're working homicide all the time, and you don't get to work with very creative people a large portion of the time. What I found talking to Matt, that was as nourishing for me as much as he was sucking information out from my knowledge base. I found that I was enjoying it because it's good speaking to a creative person, some positive energy. Do you understand where I'm coming from with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because this is the first book, and I've got to do another one and another one, so I've managed to keep Gary on side and keep talking to him. But the problem
is it bribery when you get a nice bottle of red wine delivered to your place?
Yeah. And the problem with today is that Gary, knew obviously that he'd spoken to me and the book had come out, but Gary hadn't read the book. And I'm thinking, as a writer, you always want people to read your work, but I'm thinking, it's probably better if Gary doesn't read it, because his reaction's going to be one of two things. One, I'm never talking to you again. And two, I'm going to sue you for defamation of character, because what he didn't realise is how much of him is in the book. It's not Gary, but there's physical resemblances, and obviously a lot that he
same hairstyle.
A lot that he told me is in there. So, you've had to read the book now to talk to everyone. Did you see yourself there, or?
I was, because Matt had alluded to the fact, and I think when we went to your book launch, you were talking, and those that know my story, there was a controversial period of time in the police, and it was around that time where I just left the police, and Matt offered. He said, "Look, I'd like to give you a credit for the book, like put the name on it. Thank you, blah blah blah." I thought at that time it's probably not a good idea, but you did, in a contained group of about 150 people in a pub drinking alcohol, you did say...
And they were all journos, so it was fine. It wasn't going...
You did say basically one of the main characters is based on a bald-headed detective that likes boxing and drinks green tea, or something along those lines. So Matt would ask me, have I read the book? Had I read the book? And with the work I do with the podcast, there's a lot of reading I've got to do. And I said, I've put it down as a holiday book. And I started to get worried about why he was sort of so curious if I read the book. Like, how has he portrayed me? So in the lead up to this, obviously, I've read the book, and I'm not perfect, and that's clear as day when you read his book. But there was a realism about the way that he described my character, and if it wasn't me, there's other detectives that are very similar to that. Your character development, Matt. You were asking me about police methodology. I didn't realise you were sucking the life out of who I was as a person, but that's all part of it, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. And I think, so Gary didn't want to be acknowledged in the book because he didn't know over sort of 4 or 5 hours of conversation exactly what he'd given me, and what he was worried about, given he was having his rough trot with the cops, was that he might have given me something operational that they actually don't like to see in print, and if they're already having a contretemps, that might make it worse. He hadn't done that, and actually we could have put your name there. It would have been fine. But what I was also interested in was, if you are a homicide detective, what's your motivation? Why do you do it? So there's a lot of that that I was trying to get from Gary when I was talking to him. But of course, in the book there's a male detective chief inspector, but there's also a female detective sergeant, and there's quite a bit of Gary in her as well, because what you told me I use for all of that development.
Yeah, it's interesting that I've had a lot of people that speak to me about writing fictional crime or TV series and different things and wanting to get the type of information that Matt was seeking. And one thing I say when you're talking homicide, and I make this point, you don't need car chases, you don't need this, you don't need that. Like, the crime itself is so heavy, and it affects everyone involved in it. The witnesses, the suspects, the police, the family members of the people that have been murdered. And I think you captured that, but also what drives police. And there is a certain amount of dysfunction. I think my character might have been just going through a separation or something at the time.
Yeah, I don't know where I got that from.
Yeah, that hurt. You didn't have to bring up old wounds. You could have had me happily married and living happily ever after. Would have been nicer. But that is the type of toll that you take in policing, and I think you captured that well. The other thing that I found very interesting, and I'll say it now, we're mates, but it was, I won't say frustrating, that's probably too hard a word, but Matt would ask me a question, and I'd go, yeah, it was a house in such and such a suburb. But what did the house look like, Gary? And I'd go, well, it looked like a suburban house. But, what colour was the tiles? And I'm thinking, I don't care. But you cared, and is that important to you when you're writing?
Yeah, and it's probably it was things like, the way that, so I've got something going on in Gladesville, and I'd say to Gary, what would you be doing? And, well, okay, so we'd have cameras set up on the wharves, and it was all that, and the way that you'd be doing your number plate recognition and going to the phone towers, and it was all of that stuff that I was after, which is just sort of part of Gary's job and probably not that interesting. But for me, that sort of detail was what I was after. And then it's trying to make sure you don't bog the book down in that detail, but if you can get a bit of it in there, it's hopefully interesting for readers because it might feel a bit more real.
Yeah, I see it from when I read a book, like if I enjoy the book, and I enjoyed that book because you could really visualise what you were doing. The methodology, we're cautious on that, and I had a serious conversation with Matt on what we reveal about methodology, and we protect what's what needs to be protected in regards to investigations. But even the detail that you've got with the forensic examination, because that's a big part of homicide investigations when we're looking at someone that's been murdered, the first thing we want to do is get the results from the post-mortem, and that's crucial. How was this person killed? What was there any drugs in the system? Was it a violent attack? Was there defensive wounds? That type of thing is critical to the direction that you send the investigation in. Now, I know in discussions you were hitting me up with some really deep forensic science types questions, and you actually sought out a forensic pathologist to get that type of detail.
Yeah, so along with you, I had a Dr. Alan Carla, who's a Newcastle forensic pathologist, and my relationship with him was developing the same as it was with you. Alan was very generous with his time as well as Gary, but also I think he was just into talking to an author. He was interested in what I was trying to do, and so he would sort of almost go off on tangents. And actually, a funny story: the idea for my second book, I didn't actually have an idea, and what you need, I think, is an idea.
You've got to start somewhere.
Yeah. But I was talking to Alan, this pathologist, and said, well, look, thanks for helping with the first book, because it takes so long. You'll talk to someone like Gary, and then 6 months later you say, remember me, that book's about to come out. It's like, well, glad it went somewhere. So I rang Alan and said, look, this book, the first book's coming out. I've got to do a second one. What are we going to do? And he said, I don't know, you're the bloody author. But then he came back, 10 seconds later and said, actually, if I was writing a book and I didn't want someone like me, i.e. Alan Carla, a forensic pathologist, to know how I was killing someone, this is how I'd do it. And it's like, well, Alan, there's your second idea.
Notes, so we're going to look at you. Don't take notes about this.
Yeah. But what he then came up with became the sort of driving idea for the second book.
Okay, on the issue of writing, like, did you get to a point, like, talk us through a day of a writer? Like, if we all picture you're sitting there, you got your tweed coat on, it's raining outside, you're at a country retreat, and you're sitting in front of a typewriter. What's the reality?
That's about it, yeah. Well, my wife's here, so I can't tell too many lies, but so, you know, I mightn't be getting starting at 6:30 in the morning, but it's not too much later. Yeah, I clock on about 11 and I do 3 or 4 hours and then I'm exhausted and I wait for it all to happen again the next day.
It's a pretty easy excuse, isn't it, when you just passed out on the lounge? I've got writer's block, I'm sorry. Sorry, and you've got to be left alone.
Writer's block is useful, yeah. No, but so I'm lucky enough to do it full time and I do it every day. So I do it Saturday, I do it Sunday, I do it New Year's Eve, I do it Christmas Eve. I do it Christmas Day if I could get away with it. But having said that, it really, I mean, I'm sure other writers here would say the same. It's 4 or 5 hours a day tops, and then you are really sick of it. And what I find is the next morning, there's nothing better. I'm ready to go again, and it's that cycle every day.
What about the drafts? Like, you take the book, you've got it there, you think you're happy with it, then, oh, no, I've missed something, or you've sent it through, it's been read and come back, could we make these changes? Did you go through those type of things in...
Yeah, it was a bit more brutal than that. I think for a first-time author, I was learning on the job as well, but I was lucky to be learning with a professional editor. I mean, to give you an idea of what an editor might do to an author, I'd written a draft, got some feedback, done a second draft, and it was told mostly through the point of view of a male journalist. And the professional editors had a look at it and come back and said, look, I think we need to tell this story more through the point of view of the female police officer. So it's like, right, okay. So that's basically, you're saying complete overhaul, rewrite. And that's draft 3. So I did 8 drafts with her. And so that's a structural change. They become less and less as you start to get it together. But there's always, so whole characters were being dumped, characters were changing gender. So I can't remember what you were originally.
I never told you that.
Yeah, so there's...
The powerful, the female character that you've got in the book, the Detective Sergeant Riley. I've seen a lot of police women like that, and you've got to understand policing. I was in police for 34 years, so it was a different world back there. It was very male dominated, but prior to me leaving the police a couple of years ago, I saw a lot of very competent, powerful females hold their own in that male dominated world. I think your book it's contemporary in that that's the way it is now. I won't say it's perfect, but policing is not, so that glass ceiling has been broken to a degree where female lead detectives are trusted that they can run the job.
Yeah, and that was something that you told me, which was if you're assembling a task force, you don't actually want 11 blokes who can kick in a door. You want women who can look at the world differently, interview people differently, whether they're suspects or, victims. And you want people who are dedicated, who are smart. So I sort of tried to take that idea and run with it a bit.
Yeah, and I think that added to the contemporary nature of the book, but also to the realism of the book, because the perception of police, they're all, well, the old perception, they're all 6 foot tall and they kick doors in that. It doesn't work in homicide investigations. There's a time and place for that type of policing, but the psychology of the investigation, which I like, because that was my favourite part of homicide investigation, looking into the mindset of why is this person committing this crime, that type of thing. You delve very deeply into the psychology of the whole investigation. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I spoke to a forensic psychiatrist, so he gave me some good stuff. I read things, actually a book that you'd recommended called Mindhunter, which people will know and was obviously turned into a series. There is a book on that, which is very interesting, which is Early Days of FBI Profiling. So I did bits of reading around it, but also speaking to not actually psychologists, which probably would have been smarter because they're the ones who work with the police. The psychiatrists sort of run into, you know, the people who have been convicted and are more saying to the court, look, they're mad or bad or whatever. But he was still useful just in talking, you know, what might be going through a sort of particularly nasty 15-year-old boy's mind or something like that.
Yeah, and that certainly came across. And you referenced Mindhunter John Douglas. Just to tell you the funny story about that, when I first read that book, it would have been 20 years or so ago. And I remember reading the book and I was fascinated by it. And I was working, my sergeant was Detective Sergeant Paul Jacob. And he'd read the book too, and we both sort of, you know, raving about the different approaches, the way that investigations were approached. And we would literally be at crime scenes and go, what would John Douglas do in this situation when we were stuck? But in essence, what I took away from the book, and it was a long time ago that I read, that he would proactively put messages out in the media to get a reaction. And I know, and I'm proud of the fact that you've captured that in the book, because I think that is a big part of policing. What I can tell you about policing homicide investigations, if you don't stir things up, nothing will happen. And you can sit there and just wait, and you could be waiting forever. I like the fact that they were proactive in the way that they'd message, what messaging they were putting out in the media. So obviously you were listening to what I was saying?
I did listen, yes. So that the Bowman, the reporter character, O'Neill, we won't call him Gary in the book. O'Neill wasn't particularly enamoured of the journalist because they're different sort of personalities and things. So he didn't really like him, but they used each other, and they both knew they were using each other. So I was trying to get that across. Just one quick thing on the Mindhunter. In the Mindhunter book, the FBI have called into a sort of mid-town America where they've had a particularly nasty homicide. They haven't been able to solve it for 3 years. So the local cops bring the FBI in and say, look, can you have a look at it? And John Douglas was the guy. And a woman, let's call her Anna, had been sort of brutally murdered, and they had a local guy that they really liked for it, but they couldn't pin it on him. So John Douglas said, okay, well, what we're going to do is at 3 o'clock this morning, we're going to ring this bloke. And when he answers, he's going to, you know, at 3 a.m., who is it? Hello, it's Anna. And, you know, have a female do it. And we're going to do that. And that was what they did. And it did eventually lead to them cracking it open. But I remember saying to Gary, you know, would you do that? You know, in New South Wales now. And Gary just said, nah, we would never, you could never do that. We would never do that. So, of course, in the book, what does Gary do? But exactly that.
Well, yeah, you've got to be creative in the way that you approach an investigation. That's what I like about that. If it gets to, and it's not about breaking laws or regulations, you're going to get criticised regardless in a homicide investigation, what you've done, because that's what the role of defence is, to criticise and expose any failings in the investigation or if you've crossed any lines. But you got to think outside the square. You've got to do things that are a little bit different. I got criticised, and it's public record. Not criticised, but some people were thinking, what's going on the William Tyrrell matter, where I buried a Spider-Man suit for someone to walk past and see that suit. There was nothing illegal about that. That's just creative investigation, and sometimes you've got to do that. And as I said before, if you do nothing, the investigation's not going to open up. There was other things from the John Douglas thing, and I think it was captured in the book, where he said that the offender, or it came out messaging that we believe that the offender in this case is a coward and perhaps impotent, something like that. Again, to get a reaction. So yeah, I think it is a part of policing. For the difficult jobs, you've got to think outside the square.
Yeah, and also, I mean, actually, if you're an author and sit down with Gary and say, look, I've wanting to write a sort of police procedural around a homicide, the first thing he'll probably tell you is you only need one body. You know, it doesn't have to be 3 bodies, but of course in Black River it is 3 bodies. But that helped me attempt to develop that idea that there's pressure coming down and you talked about this, there's pressure from the politicians coming down, there's pressure from command, there's pressure from the media. So, and you know, you're under this spotlight and this pressure. So I did want to try and turn it into one of those cases for the detectives in the book. You know, and there's also, of course, the idea that whoever's done it has probably done it. We know he's done it 2 times. He might have done it 3 times. He'll probably do it again if we don't stop him.
Again, that was captured in the book, that there is a pressure, a certain type of pressure, a different type of pressure. If you're doing a high-profile investigation or a serial case where if we don't catch this person, someone else might die. So there's a different type of pressure that you get, because generally speaking, homicide, the murder has happened and you're looking to catch the person responsible. But when you've got a series of murders happening, the pressure ramps up big time. And ones that we know from Sydney, well, Ivan Milat is the one that comes into mind. Also the granny killer that was operating around the North Shore. A lot of the people that I looked up to learnt their trade on that, and that was just pressure after pressure, where an elderly ladies were being murdered in a suburb, knowing, and I saw some of the cops, they went from dark haired to grey hair in a period of 12 months with the pressure that they were under, and that is some of the pressure that comes to bear. The other thing that came out, and this is very much where it gets complicated too, is how do you link these offences together? So there might be someone murdered in the North Shore, someone murdered South Sydney, someone murdered out west. What about those crimes? Is there any linkage to those crimes? So we've got to open our mind up to it. And the thought of serial killers is fairly recent. When I say fairly recent, we're talking, the John Douglas time, the FBI, where they're starting to profile people. Up until that, there wasn't a lot of skills or knowledge base that we had in policing in Australia to deal with serial killers.
Yeah, and I talking to you, that was something I did talk to you a lot about. And if the police were looking at what was happening in the story, what would they do? And one thing that Gary had said was, you don't know, you obviously don't know who's doing it. So what you have is you have 2 victims. So it's that sort of methodology around working out from the victims. Okay, where is there any link anywhere between them? Did they play netball together? Did they go to junior school together? Their parents' houses had both been on the market. So is it something to do with, open houses or real estate? So I really tried to just get that sense of just trawling through lives, their digital lives as well as, with their number plates, but also their credit cards, etc. Just trying to find that one little thing that might link them together.
And that is homicide investigation. And where I said you don't need a car chase, you don't need this. The pressure's on with the attention to detail. The attention to detail is quite often what gets you across the line. And then the type of characters that you got in the book, you can see there's a little bit of dysfunction, and even with the journalists, everyone's got their own little dysfunctions, but there's sacrifices that the journalists are making to live with that life, and also sacrifices that the cops are making. Did you see that when you were when you were working as a journalist?
Yeah, it's probably less brutal for journalists than cops, because in the end, journalists are a bit like consultants or something. They come and go, and they'll get it wrong in the reporting. Does it matter? No. Tim, I'll have shut your ears, but it's like the one, it's the one, I'm not going to call it a profession, it's the one trade where you can turn up, get everything wrong, and then turn up and do it again the next day, and it doesn't actually matter. So they've got less skin in the game, and they probably lead sort of dissolute lives because, that's what they're good at, rather than because there's pressure coming on down from them. I did want to end, I wanted to ask Gary a question. It's probably not the question you're dreading or anything, but I've been watching a show at the moment called The Long Shadow. You might have seen it. If you haven't, I recommend it. And it's about the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. It's from a book written by a journalist who's had great access to the police. So it's pretty well, I'm imagining how it unfolded for the police in the 70s. And it was interesting to me because it's a sort of thing you know about, but I didn't know much about it. And it destroyed police lives, like serious, detectives in Leeds and Manchester were just chewed up by this thing over sort of 5 years and spat out because it just went on and on and on. And they got buried in paperwork and they just couldn't solve it. And what was happening on the streets was just so despicably horrible. Everyone knew about it. But the thing that I took away from it, on the police side of it, was how much these detective chief inspectors and things loved their job and their world, and it was literally it's like a drug to them, And so my question is, do you miss that?
Yeah, it's very much so. So I've been out of the police now for 3, going on to 4 years, and there's aspects that I miss. It does become like a drug. And it's funny. I was speaking at this show yesterday to another ex-cop, Craig Semple, who was a very good detective, and he talked about it as an addiction where you couldn't get enough. You get one good case, you get that. Well, that was good, and that made me felt good. And then you go after the next one and the next one, and you become a predator. You're really out there looking for the bad guys, and that's your job. If that's what's driving you. In homicide, like I question, I think that's how I started when I started in the police, that I just wanted the next more exciting case. But I saw in homicide the devastation that it played, in the lives that it destroyed and different things like that. So mainly I was motivated by the victims, and I got to the point where you're tired, have you got the energy for it? And then you speak to the victims' families, and you go, well, yeah, this is doing the stuff. But yeah, you miss aspects about it because you've got to fully focus. And the other thing about policing, it's interesting you say that these investigations destroy lives, and with journalism, you can, if there's a mess, you can walk away from it. One thing with homicide, and I was in homicide for 25 years investigating homicides, you're accountable for everything that you do, regardless of what happens. If you don't solve the case, it's going to be scrutinised at the coroner's court. If you charge someone, you're going to be in the Supreme Court, and you're going to be asked questions, and your credibility is going to be tested. You're going to have the media scrutinising you, and also you've got the families and the community wanting answers. So it's a pressure job, and I think that creates those hard-boiled characters that you have in there. You become a little bit battle-scarred and hardened to it. But you've got to have you got to be a strong character. You've got to be a strong personality, because people are going to criticise you, and you've got to back yourself that you know what you're doing, and that's the path that you go down. But that's a long answer to do I miss it? Yes and no. I prefer just being in journalism where I can stuff up and move on to the next story. No, I like my life now. I get to speak to people like Matt and spend genuine time with them without the restrictions of am I going to get in trouble by the police for talking to a person like Matt. And what I find, and sitting here at a writers' festival talking about a fictional creation in the book, I'm enjoying the life.
Yeah, well, that's great. And, with the podcast, it's there's, weekly deadlines and all of that, so things to meet. And, I mean, you've done probably 200 podcasts now, so that's a lot of interesting people you've chatted to and got to meet.
Yeah, and it's given me a different view on crime. It's given me a more rounded view, what causes a crime, how you can fight it, not just as a detective. I'd just like to make the comment that I did have a go at fictional writing too.
I might have seen this, yeah.
Okay. I was asked, and this was about a couple of months after, or not a couple of months, about 6 months after I left the police, I think it was, and I was working with News Corp, and Claire Harvey, who was a mentor to me, she said, look, we want you to write a chapter in a book called Oh Matilda. And she said, we've got some critically acclaimed authors like Thomas Keneally and blah, blah, blah. What you had to do was write a chapter and then have I hand it over to you. And then you have to write a chapter and you had to add to it each time. I got to say that was the most confusing period of time I've had, because I was about chapter 9 or 10, I think it was, and I'm reading it. I'm making notes like I'm still a detective going, okay, where was this person, that person? And it was getting so confusing on how I was going to write this chapter because I had my detective's brain in. And then I thought, but this is just fiction. I can take it wherever I want. And I enjoyed it. It was a good experience.
Yeah, I think Matilda, I didn't read all of it. I obviously read your chapter, Gary, but I think it was also the book that meant that Peter Fitzsimons and Stan Grant have never spoken to each other again after that.
Yes, there was some controversy surrounding it, but it was a bit of fun. Hey, I'm looking at the time, so I think perhaps now we might open it to questions. If you put your hand up and we'll have a microphone delivered.
While waiting, we do have a question over Zoom from an anonymous attendee, and it says, apart from the more obvious alcohol and drug dependencies, do authors capture weakness in their detectives realistically?
I don't know. So, okay, who's Matt's alcohol, drug dependency or mine? Is that, do you think that's a realistic caption? This is the way I'm interpreting the question. Alcohol, the way that cops are portrayed in the fictional crime series, and also reporters, the scruffy reporter walking around with his notepad or her notepad. I think there is a bit of realism to it. From what I've seen in the world, I know that there's prices that get paid in both professions. Now that I've worked in both professions, that sometimes people throw themselves into the job a little bit more than they should, and there's some damage that comes, and that might be, whether it's alcohol or just finding some peace somewhere else. Would you agree? Yeah,
green tea works as well. So
that's to sober me up.
Green tea and boxing, yeah.
I have seen it. I've seen it in the police, and that's the pressure. That's the way people release the pressure. And I know my life got to a point in time where it felt like it'd be a character in a book like Matt's, where you've been on the job, you've been up for 24 hours, you come home, there's nothing in the fridge, you make yourself some crappy meal, have a beer, and then go to sleep, and then do it all the next day. That does become your life to a degree when you throw yourself into it 100%.
I've read Black River, and I was very impressed with the technical side of the work. I think, as you said, you don't need to put a lot in, because once you've proven yourself, the author can take you anywhere. I was so jealous of you talking about all the experts that you've spoken to, because I'm sort of assuming, because you've got a journalistic background, you had an entree of credibility before you even approached these people. But do you have any sort of advice for would-be writers who don't have that entree? Because I know a lot of police officers who are currently working aren't willing to talk to people, and obviously you're taking up professionals' time, and so many people are writing crime now, so the demands must be great. Do you have any tips for trying to get SME advice?
Well, I think with me it did come back to my journalism, because I was used to interviewing people, so that helped. But you're probably right as well. Gary's probably thinking, look, Rob's put me in, who is this? Well, he worked at the Australian, so there's some credibility there perhaps, or lack of credibility. So it's that. And then I think you actually, without sort of wanting to appear insistent, just need to be insistent. And this is what you need to get your book done. So you've just got to be like a dog with a bone. And whether you want to treat the person you're approaching as a consultant, because you're trying to pick their brain. So maybe you might think about paying for their time or something. I mean, I had an editor who edited this book, and as a debut author, you don't have publishers or editors. So I paid her. I mean, she was contracted to do it. So there's always that route. But yeah, I think you sort of have to pick your mark and stick with it. And red wine. Well, pick your mark on that too, but yeah.
Any other questions? Now, I've just got to say, John, please. I don't know if you've heard of John Killick. We're very good friends, John Killick and I. You might have heard some person that escaped from Silverwater prison in a helicopter, which was hijacked by his Russian girlfriend. Ladies and gentlemen, John Killick.
Yeah, believe me, this question's got nothing to do about escapes, Chips. It was great talk that I actually learned something from this today. But Matthew, as a writer, first book, I've read a lot of crime fiction, especially when I was younger, and I've always liked it. But do you see this character that you've created? Do you see it going any further? Do you see maybe a second book, or even maybe have you thought about screenplay, stuff like that? Do you think you could do that type of thing?
I wouldn't try and do a screenplay, but hopefully someone else might. But I think with an author, you just have to say, "This is my baby, and if you want to buy it and fiddle around with it, go for it." But leave it to them.
Right.
Because it took me long enough to figure out how to write a book. So, to the idea that I'm now going to try and write a screenplay, I think you leave that to the people who are good at it and want to do it. But yes, so I'm contracted to do 3 books. This is the first, and it will be a series around not the Gary character, sadly, but one of the characters in the book will go over, hopefully 3 books. The second one is about to be torn apart in the editing process. It's just got in literally sort of yesterday.
It hurts, doesn't it? I know.
It will hurt, and that will hopefully come out in next August.
All right, thank you, Matthew.
We have a question from Zoom. Do you have any idea how many police officers are badly affected by PTSD that they need to leave the force?
Answer to that, no. I don't have an idea on the number. I will say that the police are approaching it or recognising that there is a problem there and trying to address it. Now, I saw the changes in the 34 years I was in the police, where in homicide, it was mandatory to sit down with a psychologist every 6 months and sort of debrief. We're a bit cynical about that to start with, but I think there's a change in culture where we're understanding that you do that little bit of maintenance early and it stops these problems. But I don't know the numbers, but it is something that as an organisation, policing across the country, I would suggest, are aware of and trying to deal with.
I had a question. With Mindhunter and sort of behavioural profiling, Matt had said to me in his limited expertise.
Wife, Gary, by the way, if you haven't been.
Hi there. He had said that really since DNA, that had gone out the window. Is that right?
Yeah, and I again that came across in the book, and I hadn't looked at it from that point of view. Yes, DNA has given us a big, when I say us, like the police going after these type of people, given us a big advantage. And the profiling may or doesn't carry as much weight. But I still think I'm fairly relevant in the field of policing. And I know when I left the police, I was consulting regularly with a psychologist, Dr. Sarah Ewell, and depending on the type of investigation, I would embed her in the investigation and I'd get advice, bounce ideas. So I still think there's a place there, but with the advent of DNA and forensic science, it is changing the landscape. And quite frankly, I think it's getting harder and harder to be a criminal. Like, you can get tracked everywhere, and the pendulum has swung back in favour of law enforcement, I think. But no, there will always be because you don't always get DNA, so there'll always be a need. But we'd only, as a homicide detective, I'd say probably 40% of the cases that I'd consult with on a forensic psychologist, and Sarah, and I was using her more than a lot of people were. It was she was sitting round the corner. No one knew she was there, and I was dragging her into investigations. But I felt it very handy to have someone that's looking at a case from a different mindset than what police look at it. So I'd be going, what about this person? Yeah, well, maybe, but blah, blah, blah. And it would open my mind up to thinking in different ways.
We have another question from Zoom. This is a question for Gary. What is it like to read about police in crime fiction?
Well, it depends how they're portrayed. The fact that, and you can see Matt is such a nice human being. The fact that he was worried about offending me in the book. Look, I think they make interesting characters. They make interesting characters because it's an interesting world in which they operate. So, as a police officer, I'll read some or watch some fictional crime stuff, and I can relate to certain aspects of it. But I think they just make for good reading, good viewing, because they are such complex characters, and the world that they're operating in is a world that most people don't get to see in day-to-day life. So I think that's what makes the characters interesting. Would you agree, Matt?
Yeah, and if I read a book that is perhaps featuring a journalist and it's not written by a journalist, it's the same thing. You sort of think, well, it's not quite like that. But if the book's good, it doesn't really matter. So the way I approached trying to write from the perspective of a police officer, having really never been in a police station, let alone an officer, was really I saw my duty of care was to the reader, and I'm trying to write an entertaining book for the reader. So the way I approached that was to get as much detail as I could from, for instance, Gary, but then you are on your own. And so what I hope Black River is believable to you if you're not a police officer. But I mean, I remember reaching my wife, who is a doctor and gives the book to every patient that comes through the door. And they all come back and say, oh, we loved your husband's book. But then she said, I gave it to this cop. And she came back and I said, Rita said, how was it? And the cop said, oh, it was all right. And, she's offended for me, but I'm there thinking, well, of course, because, it's actually probably not a very accurate portrayal of a police officer's life. But I think for the author, you just have to leave that. Unless you are a police officer writing fiction. You just have to do as good a job as you can and then leave it at that.
Yeah, I think it's really boring where police will read or watch a show and go, oh, that doesn't happen, that doesn't happen. It's like, we've all got expertise in some field, some area. We're writing to interest people, to entertain people. It's not being sold as this is a factual account of the Black River murders. This is. I hope it's not. I hope it's not, because there is a lot of you in there too, just quietly. But yeah, loosen up a little bit. It's entertainment, that type of thing. But from a police officer's point of view, I don't mind seeing a book out like this or others that show the impact that the crime has. That's why I don't like this, the car chases, this blows up, and you don't have in your day-and-day policing, you don't have hundreds of people being killed. It's just each life is important, and if the way that they tell the story is about one murder or in this a series of three, and that's not unusual. I've been on investigations where you're looking at three killings all linked. But just don't take it too seriously. If people get bogged down with, oh, that didn't happen because you've got to actually fill out this form, who cares? But I think Matt has captured in this book what I consider the crucial parts, the important parts of what an investigation is about.
Question for Gary. How often do people get away with murder?
Too often. We're in, and I don't know the exact statistics, but the majority of people that have murdered do get caught, and sometimes it takes a very long time, and I'm heartened to see some historical cases where someone that thinks they've got away with it now with improvements of DNA all of a sudden have been caught. Most people don't get away with murder, and I'd like to, the risk is if they do get away with murder, what always concerned me about that, and this is, I was talking serial killers, that if they get away with murder, then they become a little bit more emboldened and think, okay, I've done it once, they're desensitised, and then it happens again. I dare say when you look at what happens in the organised crime field, it's very much that. Stuff that, we blew that bloke away, and we haven't been caught, let's hit the other crew. That type of thing, but I honestly believe, like I know the world, it would be hard to get away with murder now. You are tracked everywhere. If we wanted to find out where every one of you went today, unless John hired a helicopter, there's a good chance we could follow you and track you to your home. And I think that's people have got to be mindful of that. It's a changing environment.
Hi, the connection between journalists and police, there's lots of ex-journalists from Michael Connolly to everybody who write, and it's a nice literary and television type of hook. How real is it? Do the police really like talking to journalists and vice versa in an open or off-the-record basis?
Well, I think Gary will know more, but I think the answer is probably yes. And I think a good... I'm actually taking this from the Manchester story I was just watching. The police in that had very open communications with journalists, because what they wanted to do in that case was use the public. And they needed information from the public, and the way that you get that is by putting it out through the media. So they would look at the media really as just another tool in their arsenal, and obviously you probably do need to work on, relations with particular reporters, so that you can call them up and you might have done something before and it's worked well for you. But I think the police, whether they, in this book, the journalist almost gets embedded, that might be taking it a step further. But I think that definitely, a good homicide cop is going to be talking to the press.
Yeah, look, and I think the important point to hang on to here is that it's a tool that police can use with their contact and discussions with journalists. I say old days. Early in my career as a young detective, there was some trusted, and there wasn't that many crime reporters around, there was some trusted reporters that knew what was going on. They'd be drinking with the coppers, the older coppers, and they'd know that they were trusted and the information wasn't leaked. The world of journalism has changed a great deal, and the police don't have as much control over journalism, because there's so many people that can report, or social media, so there's a changing landscape. I think it's a necessary and important relationship to have between police and the media. Not only have you got to solve the crime, but you've got to reduce fear in the community, so there's some strong messaging that's going out. I also like to think that any time a police officer is speaking to the media, they're speaking with a reason and a purpose. What I don't like, and this is a pet hate of mine, and I've seen it and I think it's starting to fall away, is where there's been a murder and you see someone in uniform stand up and go, we don't know what's happened. We've got no CCTV, we've got no witnesses, no nothing. We don't know what's happened. That is the wrong messaging to put out. I think the messaging should always be that the police are in control. And so the relationships develop through the professional relationships, but there's a line that can't be crossed. And everyone's, I think, very much aware of that these days, and mindful of that you've got to, both sides have got to keep their professional integrity.
The question that I've got is probably for Gary, but as well for you, Matthew. In that, at the Long Shadow, there were the attitudes of the police, and I guess this is for you, Gary, because the first few murder cases were prostitutes. There was kind of a feeling of, oh, well, they kind of asked for it. And so I don't actually think it was given the credibility for being a serial killer early on. And I kind of want to know whether those attitudes within the police force are still as prevalent, or whether that really has changed. And the other thing, the key piece of evidence that actually possibly led to that investigation destroying people and taking so much longer, was the piece of evidence that was given to the press, which was the tape by the person who purported to be the murderer. Would that happen nowadays, that something like that, a piece of evidence like that, would be released to the public? Because in that case, it completely skewed the investigation.
Could you repeat the question? It was very inaudible.
Yeah, I can. Do you want me to go first? So we're talking about the Yorkshire Ripper and this show that's been on, which is I think a fairly sort of decent rendition, a dramatised rendition of what went on. There was a lot of, so the question was, the women who were being killed to begin with were prostitutes, and did that mean the police didn't treat them as well as they should have? And second, there was a hoax tape delivered to the police purporting to be the killer, and we now know that it wasn't, and it sent the cops down a wombat hole that they never really came out of, and completely derailed the investigation. And would that now happen? So I'll let Gary answer, but I think in the show, for me, it was a very interesting look at Leeds in the 70s. There was a lot of it was a mill town, sort of cotton, and a lot of that had fallen away. There was a lot of tenement housing, there was a lot of immigration, there was a lot of very poor people, and there was, I mean, I didn't realise this, there was a lot of prostitution going on, and that was just part of the fabric of the town. And I think that did, you know, the police cared and wanted to solve it, but they probably also, I think what they took from it was the rest of the society was less worried because it was prostitutes being killed. So it was how everyone else viewed that rather than the police themselves. They wanted to solve it because they knew they had this horrible killer. But they might have hidden behind that a little bit. That's my understanding of it. With the hoax, well, I'll leave that to Gary. I mean, whether people might actually, I'm sure there's a lot of information. If you've got a hotline, you got hundreds of people ring up saying, it's me, right? Which is why you hold information back. Only the person who did it could know.
Yeah, but two parts on that is everyone treated equally in the eyes of the law, or what response if someone's killed. I'd love to say yes, but I don't think that's the case. I honestly think some investigations are given more effort or more attention. And it's not just a fault of the police, it's society's not demanding answers, the media aren't interested, and I reference something that's been a big part of my career when 3 Aboriginal children were murdered back in 1990-91, and I was at pains to get people interested in it. It wasn't properly resourced. I became involved in it 25 years ago, and I dare say, and I've said it publicly so many times, if it was 3 white kids from the North Shore that were all living in the same street that were murdered over a 6-month period, and their bodies or clothing that they were wearing at the time of their disappearance was dumped in a similar location, could you imagine the outrage? Unfortunately, that's not the case. So, yeah, I'd like to think everyone's treated equally, but I think some... And what is it? What is the difference? Whether it's socio-economic, if it's race, it's what I believe what people can identify with, and that's if someone's killed or someone disappears. Yeah, I can relate to that. But I think the general public were thinking, well, these were 3 kids. They were living on an area known as a mission in an Aboriginal community. Well, that wouldn't happen down here, and therefore that wasn't the outrage. So yeah, I answer. I'd like to think no one's treated differently. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the law, but if I'm honest, I don't think that's the case. And it's not just the fault of the police, it's the politics, the courts, the media, society in itself, where we demand justice. On false leads or false information, you can't accept all the information that comes in to a large inquiry, like the amount of calls that you get that where someone's disappeared, that they've seen this person or that, and false information. You've just got to sift through it. You've got to start off with, okay, that's the information, then you've got to fact check, and that's the way that you do it. What's released to the media or to the public, there are holdback things. So when someone walks into the police station, and I've had it where people come in and they put their hand up for a crime, but they don't know the detail of the crime. If we released all the information about what happened at the crime scene, someone could come in and put their hand up and say they're involved, and for some reason some weirdos like to confess to murders that they haven't done. You could put that in the next book. I'm mindful of the time. Is there one last question? No? Okay, I'm getting that. I'm interpreting that as wrap it up.
I think you've had enough. Yeah,
okay. Matt will be out there signing books after this. Thanks so much for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. And Matt, thanks for a good book, a good read.
Thanks, Gary.